Oh, yes, yes, yes. Please come in, ladies. Come in, mademoiselles. Today is the 9th of September. As you know, what you talk about on the 9th of September is a continuation of what I talked about yesterday. A window on what to play for 9.1.5. This is not another one of those videos where we talk about specs and what, if they are doing well or if they are doing badly or if one is OP or one could be very strong, etc., etc. This is talking about the different specs from different perspectives because, believe it or not, I know this is difficult to understand, but sometimes people are going to choose a spec to play not entirely based on how strong they are, not because they check online, maybe one of the class discords, maybe on Reddit, on YouTube, maybe some Twitch streams, and they're going to be told that spec X is flavor of the month and OP or will be very strong, and they will just follow that spec. Some other people might say, yeah, okay, but that spec sucks dick. I don't really want to play that. It's boring, or it's tedious, or it's maybe it plays too fast, maybe it plays too slow, maybe it's too complicated, maybe it's not my style. So there are multiple avenues that people can look for when they choose if a spec intrigues them, if a spec could be interesting for them to play. So what we're looking at today is something that I went over months and months and months ago, because it was basically before the first raid of the expansion even started, so some 10 months ago, which was how fast, how quick the specs play, their rotation, their role. How many buttons are you expected to be clicking? How fast you're supposed to be playing the specs? Because there are going to be quite some differences between the speed of the specs. There are certain specs that are literally, unironically, twice as fast as others. So imagine playing a spec, and then just know that some other specs would have pressed twice as many buttons as you just did in the same period of time. And this can affect the way people can enjoy a role, a spec, and a class based on how quick it plays. Maybe you like the theme, maybe you like the transmog, maybe you like the sound and the visual effects of the abilities, perhaps even the type of damage. Maybe you enjoy doing quick burst of damage, maybe you enjoy doing lots of AoE, or maybe you enjoy being very strong in single target, but then there is the problem of the spec being too fast for you, or the spec being too slow for you, for example. So, in this video, we're going to be looking at how fast the specs are playing, and also, if there is something interesting to point out, if these specs have gotten faster over time. Because as I said, we looked at this the first time 10 months ago, but now, since 10 months ago, several specs have gotten, say, 20% more haste, maybe 30% more mastery, which does something to make them press more abilities. And then there is Blizzard. We have had balance tuning, abilities have been balanced, talents have been balanced, classes and specs have changed their talent setups, and then we have gotten legendaries. Covenant-specific legendaries changed the way certain specs wanted to play, certain Covenant swaps for certain specs have happened, so several of these changes might have impacted how fast a spec is going to play. Now, Starting with the obvious, starting with the standalone look at the tanks, because for those who don't know, for those who haven't realized this, tanks are always going to have a much higher average of button presses because they have active mitigation. Active mitigation is off the global cooldown. So if your global cooldown is 1.5 seconds and it scales with haste, that's how fast you get to press your abilities as a Retribution Paladin. But if you're a Protection Paladin, you can use, for example, Shield of the Righteous, which is your active mitigation armor increase, bypassing this global cooldown, which makes them have a higher than average button presses. There are, however, still differences within this higher than average button presses because, as we can see here, Protection Paladin used to be the fastest of all tanks, and this was back in PR. PR means pre-raid, so this was the simulation of how a tank in 184-ish, pre-raid, Mythic 0, Mythic Dungeon, at the start of Shadowlands, basically before you could get into the raid, how were you expected, how fast were you expected to be. Now, the only main significant change of this compared to where we were in Castelnatria is that Death Knight has gotten, luckily, thank God, has gotten some 20-ish% faster, so now it is much more in line with the other tanks. So what we are looking at today in current modern times is that Prot Paladin is still very, very fast. Prot Paladin gets to generate a ton of holy power. Generating a ton of holy power allows them to use a ton of Shield of the Righteouses, which means off the GCD abilities. So they are literally pressing more than one ability per second, which is blisteringly fast as a spec. The other specs look much slower by comparison, but they are still very high. Anything that gets above 50 and gets closer to 55 is pretty quick, because it's basically almost one click per second. So it is pretty impressive. Of course, Death Knight is still generally the slowest one together with Druid, because they are gated by cooldowns the most. They are gated by resources the most. It's much easier for a Paladin to be able to use their abilities because they are gated by Holy Power compared to the Runic Power and the runes of a Blood Decay or the Rage, and the fixed cooldowns, for example, of Frenzied Regen or the cooldown of Trash of a Guardian Druid. But what about the DPS? Because in this type of scenario, we can't really look at healers. Healers are not going to do the same thing every time. They're not expected to heal in the exact same way, so they're going to differ in the way they want to heal, which means they're going to differ in the amount of buttons they press. If you want a rough estimate, the fastest healers are the healers with the most amount of instant abilities, which means Holy Paladin, Discipline Priest, and Restoration Druid are going to be faster than Holy Priest, Restoration Shaman, and Mystiver Monk. Holy Paladin's entire kit is literally instant, and they have some very easy to spam abilities like Crusader Strike, like Judgment, Refreshing Consecration, using Hammer of Wrath. All those instant abilities they can press very often, together with Holy Shock, Light of the Martyr, and their finishers are all instants, so they are on the faster end of healers, together with Resto Druid, which is of course Rejuvenation spam, which is instant, as well as Discipline Priest, which has a lot of Power War Shield spamming, which is also instant. Meanwhile, the hard casting or even the channeling spells like Mystiver Monk, or the hard casting of Shamans with Healing Rain, with Healing Wave, with Wellspring, it makes them have far fewer casts, together with Holy Priest and their perma spam of heal, thanks to their Flash Concentration Legendary. Those are on the lower end of casts. So, looking at the DPS, as I was saying, there is going to be the obvious divide. This is something very easy to pinpoint very quickly, which is the fact that there are some types of DPS that are called casters, which means they have to cast. And if you are casting, you're not bound to be pressing lots of buttons, right? If you are pressing a Chaos Bolt or an Incinerate, well, you have to stand still until the cast is over. Meanwhile, if you are a melee DPS, you don't have casts, you have instant abilities, so you are bound to be much faster if you are melee. So this is going to be a very easy divide. Towards the top, we will see majority of the spots being taken by melee DPS, with a couple of exceptions being casters, and then at the bottom we will see mostly casters with the slowest of the melee DPS. So starting from the bottom, somehow, some way, there has been a development, because back in the start of the expansion, we knew that Arcane Mage was very slow. Okay, let's put it that way. Arcane Mage was basically bound by spamming Arcane Blast and spamming Arcane Missiles. They were playing back then Night Fae, so they have shifting power to get their cooldowns back faster and go back in their burst windows faster, but the most of their abilities were still just those two buttons, Arcane Blast and Arcane Missiles. The problem is that somehow, some way, now they managed to become even slower. Once they went Kyrian and no longer Night Fae, they managed to go from 38 APM, 38 abilities per minute, down to 33. So basically one ability every 2 seconds, effectively. So this is, for you, the slowest possible range spec you can play. So in the context of choosing what to play in 9.1.5, changing your main, looking at an alt to play, if you wanted to look at, if you were interested in just how fast a spec is going to play, either because you want one that is fast, or you don't want one that is fast, but you want one that is rather slow, then Arcane Mage would be the absolute best pick for being slow, for not pressing too many buttons and chilling most of the time, being stuck in a cast. But Arcane Mage is not alone at the bottom when it comes to casters. Sure, 33 APM is quite low, no other caster is going to get that low, but it is going to be joined all together by all of the Warlock specs: Demonology, Destruction, and Affliction. They have all gone slightly up by 2 to 3 to 4 extra abilities per minute over time from the start of the expansion to now, but they're still rather slow. They are mostly cast based, all three of them. Affliction has instant dots, but once they are applied, all they have to do is to be reapplied every once in a while. The rest of their abilities will be casts. Destruction is basically almost entirely hard casted except for Conflagrate, so it's also going to be very slow in terms of abilities, and also Demonology has quite a lot of casts. As you're seeing, the Warlocks are surrounding the first melee spec of the list, which is Feral Druid. So last time we looked over this, there was a war at the bottom for the slowest of the melee DPS spec, which is also something you might be interested in. This fight had been going on for ages. It has been almost like an epic. It could make a pretty good movie or a TV series between Assassination Rogue and Feral Druid. The two bleed-based dot specs were both being very low, which is kind of interesting. You're making the same team for two different specs, and they are also playing in a very similar way. They both play with combo points, they both have finishers which leave behind dots, and a big damage, instant damage finisher. They both work with energy, they are both leather based, they are both dual wielding. Assassination dual wields daggers and Feral dual wields paws. So it has also been pretty striking how the specs are very, very similar in basically everything they do. After 10 months almost, however, Feral Druid is the one that hasn't really gained much of anything. They are still playing Night Fae. They changed their legendary, but their new legendary is not really changing anything in the way they play, or rather in how many buttons they get to press, so it has remained mostly the same. Also because it is a type of spec that is gated by both energy and combo points, it's not that getting more haste over these 10 months have made them much of any quicker and faster to play, as opposed to other specs we will see that did benefit from getting more and more haste to become faster and faster. And also, to top this off, Feral Druids don't even look for haste. They don't really go for haste anyways, so it's not that it was going to change much of anything for them. As I mentioned, however, Feral was there with Assassination, and Assassination, for now, is nowhere to be seen at the bottom. We continue to go up to the top, going through Marksmanship, going through Elemental, and two more melee DPS specs, Arms Warrior and Frost Death Knight. The interesting thing is that Elemental seems to have dropped ranks in speed compared to before, but the difference is simply that Elemental has stayed the same, while a few handful other specs have gone up. Elemental hasn't really changed the way they play. They have had the same two legendaries since the start of the expansion, Echoes of Great Sundering for AoE, and Windspeaker's Lava Resurgence ever since they got it from the World Boss. It's been the main way to play. They are in the process of changing Covenant, going to Night Fae, but that is not changing too much in what they want to do with their abilities. Elemental also does not go for haste. They don't get to be faster or press more buttons if they have more haste over time, so it's not really changing how they play. Arms Warrior has increased a little bit. They are now roughly a little bit over 10% faster than they were before. This is just normal, standard increase in item level, more haste, faster GCDs, more abilities to press, more rage generation means they simply get to press more abilities. Then we enter the big clump in the middle, from Frost DK all the way up to Red Paladin. You have Frost DK, you have Shadow Priest, you have Assassination Rogue, Unholy DK, Windwalker, Druid, and Retribution Paladin. None of them have changed particularly from before, but what we can say is that this again starts to be the average, 50 to 55 APM. It's kind of the average where some people might feel like this is fast and some people might feel like this is slow. So this is going to be much more up to preference. The biggest surprise of all of this that we mentioned when we were talking about Feral is Assassination, which has now gotten almost 20% faster. This can be much more easily visualized when I show you the downtime, literally meaning how much time, how many seconds on average is a spec going to spend without clicking buttons, because they have nothing to do. They have no resources, or everything is on cooldown, so they can't press anything. We mentioned that the casters have the downside of having to cast, so having to lock themselves in place and not click a button until the cast is over, and it makes it look like melee DPS don't have a downside. Clearly, clicking abilities and get them to have an effect instantly is much better than having to stand still and finish a cast. The downside of the melee DPS is that sometimes you simply won't have abilities left to cast because you won't have them available. And to show this more clearly, when you look at the downtime, amount of time the specs won't have anything to do, you see that the entire list, pretty much the entirety of the list, is completely filled with melee specs. The only spec that isn't a melee one in there is Beast Mastery, and that's because it's basically a melee spec playing from ranged. No caster are there, it's just melee. And you can see that from before, where Assassination was again fighting with Feral to have the longest possible downtime of having to pool energy, having to wait, having to get your combo points up, wait for the cooldowns to come back. Now it has gotten much lower. Over the course of 10 months, over the course of a tier, more than a tier, I guess a tier and a half, Assassination has lost over 30 seconds of downtime. So they get to press way more abilities more often nowadays compared to before. So now they are no longer in that very slow, very static type of playstyle that they used to have for a long time, together with Feral. Now we start going towards the top for people who are interested in fast playing specs that are a little bit quicker. You have Fire Mage, Enhancement Shaman, BM Hunter, Balance Druid, Survival Hunter, and Sub Rogue. We are starting to get into the 60 now, into the 60 APM, into the 1 click per second window, and of course you see that we start to lose out more and more range DPS specs. It's more and more melee now. None of these specs have changed too much from when we started the expansion, with the exception of Balance Druid, who is now about 15% faster after going to Ventir. They simply get to press more stuff more often. That's just a normal scaling situation. And you can see, of course, that even though Assassination has gotten much faster and much quicker to play compared to before, they are still 20% slower than Sub Rogue. What is also funny is that Sub Rogue itself is going to be almost 20% slower than Outlaw, because at the top of the fastest playing specs, we have Frost Mage, Havoc, Demon Hunter, Fury Warrior, and Outlaw Rogue. So the only outlier of the top list when it comes to the fastest specs is one range spec, which is Frost Mage. Frost Mage is a pretty good example to show you what happens when you get faster, when you get to generate your resources faster, either because you have more haste or because you have more procs happening. When you look at this is Mage from the start of the expansion, and then this one is the Mage now, and the amount of time they spend casting these things. And you're like, these are the same image. Like, they are spending the same time doing the same things. They changed like nothing at all. Yes, of course, they are spending the same time. The difference is that now they get to do it more often and more quickly. Before, for example, during this 5-something minute fight, you could expect 112 Frostbolt casts, 101 Ice Lance casts, and 42 Flurry casts. Now, 10 months later, you get 134 Frostbolt casts, 115 Ice Lances, and 48 Flurries. So even though the time spent is exactly the same, it's just faster. So this is not a case of, oh, the entire spec got reworked. Now they are much faster because they get to play multiple things, diverse, dynamic. No, it's just the same 3 buttons, just much faster. And also at the very top, there is the example of Havoc, which is the same thing. You know, before, you look at this and you're like, wow, I thought Havoc was a 2-button spec. What are all of these abilities they are using? All of these things they are clicking? Well, 10 months later, Havoc looks like this. So they lost a whole bunch of stuff. You know, it's gotten to the point, if you haven't kept up with this, that especially on single target, Havoc doesn't even bother to use Blade Dance anymore. Literally not even clicked, because it costs Fury, and you don't want to spend Fury for Blade Dance because you want to spend Fury for your Chaos Strike or for your Annihilation. So it might be misleading. Don't think that just because a spec is faster, just because a spec play more quickly, it must mean it's some super interesting and diverse and engaging type of spec. In some cases, like these 2 ones, like Havoc and Frost, it's literally just pressing the same buttons just very, very quickly. And we close at the top in the same way we closed the start of the expansion, and the same way we closed the end of BFA, and then the middle of BFA, and then the start of BFA, which is Outlaw being the fastest playing spec. So that is the one you want to go for if you want a very quick, a very fast playing spec together with Fury Warrior. Both of them are very, very quick and fast. So this is what we have when we're looking at how quickly these specs are playing. As I said, it might be one of the points you are looking at. You are grading all of the different specs when you're choosing what to play. Maybe you have your little clipboard with all the different things you're looking for when you're looking for a spec. Which races are available to the spec? How cool does the transmog look? How nice the abilities look and sound? Is the spec ranged or melee? Does it play fast or slow? Is it complicated or simple? So you might have an entire list of things you use to rate your spec. Maybe you have just one. Is it OP? But okay, in this case, it's much more simple to determine. So instead, we looked at this for today. We looked at how quickly the specs are currently playing, in case you were interested in either a quick spec or a slow playing spec. So with this, we can stop the video. We have gone, once again, way too long with this, so we can stop now. Let me guys know if you have any preferences related to this, if you've ever actually thought of this, or maybe if you have subconsciously went for perhaps faster specs or slower specs without really paying attention to it. But now that you hear it mentioned, you realize that all of the specs you favor are very quick specs. Perhaps, maybe you will find a correlation, you will discover. That's how you get to decide which specs you enjoy, their speed. Thank you guys anyways for watching the video. If you have enjoyed the content and you want to support the channel, leave a like on the video, comment down below, and head over to the Japanese consulate of your country to ask if they can subscribe you to my channel. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, why exactly is it hotter in September than in August? Please, enough already. I want my sweaters.